She got dressed for a man who never showed up. I heard the silence behind her door before I heard anything else that night, and what came out of my mouth wasn't a single word I had planned to say. By the time I figured out what I actually meant, it was already too late to take it back, and I didn't want to anyway. My name is Wyatt Doyle, and for 6 years I've been the maintenance man at Magnolia Court, a 3-story brick building on the edge of Dayton, with a carpet in the hallways that's older than some of the tenants who walk on it. I used to work the assembly line at a parts plant across the river, until the whole thing shut down without much warning, and took my left knee with it on the way out, a souvenir from a forklift that clipped me on my last shift. Now I fix leaky faucets, replace dead bulbs, patch drywall, and carry a ring of keys heavy enough to leave a red mark on my hip by the end of the day. I know which apartments have kids that leave bikes in the stairwell, and which ones go quiet on Sunday mornings from a hangover. Most folks in that building know me the way you know a doorknob. Useful. Always there when something breaks. Never really looked at twice otherwise, and for a long time, that suited me just fine. I've been a widower for 4 years. My wife Carol used to say I fixed things because I didn't know how to say the things that actually needed saying, and she wasn't wrong, not even a little. I raise our daughter Ruthie alone now, 16 years old and sharper than me in every way that matters, the kind of kid who catches me staring at nothing and asks if I'm okay before I even know I'm not. Most nights after she's asleep, I walk the building one last time, checking locks, listening for anything that sounds like trouble, because it's easier to look after other people's peace than sit still with my own. It's a small life, and for a long stretch, I told myself it was enough, that wanting more than a paid-off truck and a quiet apartment was a door I'd lost the right to open the day Carol didn't come home from the hospital. I kept her photo on the dresser, not to grieve exactly, more like a reminder of what a person could look like when they let themselves be happy out loud, something I'd forgotten how to do. That Thursday in October, my last round took me past the second floor, and I noticed something wrong outside apartment 2C. Not a bad kind of wrong, a quiet kind. The kind where there should have been laughing, or music, or the clink of glasses through a thin door, because everybody on that floor knew Elena Marsh had a date that night, her first one since her divorce. Instead, there was nothing. No voices, no footsteps. Just a silence that didn't belong there, and it stopped me cold in that hallway. I stood outside her door for a full minute before I raised my hand to knock, and when she opened it, mascara run down to her jaw and a dress on that she'd clearly put on for somebody who never came. I had no idea what I was about to say to her. I only knew I couldn't walk away. I didn't know it yet, standing there, but I was about to trade places with the man who'd left her waiting, and before long, the whole building would end up picking a side. If a story like this is speaking to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you will not want to miss where this one goes next. Elena didn't say much at first. She just stepped back from the door and let me in, like she'd used up every ounce of pride keeping herself upright and didn't have any left over to send me away. Her apartment smelled like the candle she must have lit an hour earlier, expecting company that wasn't me, and there was a bottle of wine on the counter still sealed, 2 glasses set out next to it, like a small, hopeful lie she'd told herself before the night went sideways. I didn't know what to do with my hands, so I put the kettle on instead, because that's the only language I've ever really trusted, doing something useful, while the hard part sorts itself out in the background. She didn't stop me. She just sat down at her little kitchen table and watched me move around her cabinets like I belonged there, which, looking back, might have been the first small miracle of that whole night. I found the mugs on the second try, the tea bags behind a box of crackers she probably forgot she owned, and by the time the kettle started whistling, some of the color had come back into her face. She told me his name was Grant, and that he'd texted an hour after he was supposed to arrive, some excuse about work that didn't hold water even a little. She laughed when she said it, But it wasn't the kind of laugh that means something's funny. It was the kind that keeps a person from crying in front of a stranger. I sat across from her at that table, and for the first time since I'd started working in that building, somebody looked at me like I was a person instead of a uniform with a tool belt hanging off it. She asked what happened to my knee, and I told her the truth about the forklift, instead of the short version I usually give people who ask out of politeness and don't actually want the answer. She asked about Ruthie, and her whole face changed, talking about a kid she'd only ever waved at in the hallway between shifts. It was close to midnight before either of us noticed the time had gotten away from us entirely, and when I finally stood up to leave, she walked me to the door and thanked me for something neither of us could quite put a name to yet. After that night, something shifted, quiet and small. The kind of change you'd miss completely if you weren't paying attention to a building you'd spent 6 years learning to read. She started leaving her blinds cracked in the evenings, just an inch, just enough. I started finding reasons to check the hallway light outside 2C more often than any bulb actually needed checking, twice some weeks, which Ruthie would have called suspicious if she'd been keeping count. Some mornings I'd leave a coffee outside her door before her shift at the hospital, no note attached, because I didn't trust myself to write one that didn't say more than I meant to admit yet. She never mentioned it out loud, not once, but the mug would always turn up washed and sitting back on my own doorstep by evening, upside down to dry in the sun, like a small message passed back and forth without a single word spoken between the two of us. I started looking forward to that walk down the hallway more than I looked forward to almost anything else in my day, and I didn't examine that too closely at the time. It wasn't romance, not yet, not anything either of us would have dared to call by name out loud. It was closer to two tired people finding out, almost by accident, that they made each other's days a little less heavy to carry. She'd knock on my door some evenings with a leaky shower head that didn't really need fixing, just an excuse to sit on my ratty couch and talk about her patients, the ones she couldn't save and carried home with her anyway, and the ones who made her laugh so hard she cried in the break room afterward. I'd fix the shower head regardless, slower than the job required, twisting the same fitting twice if I had to, because the job was never really the point, and we both understood that without saying it. Ruthie noticed before either of us admitted anything to ourselves, and started setting an extra plate at dinner some nights without asking permission, just quietly assuming Elena might wander down. And more often than not, she did, still in her scrubs, laughing at something Ruthie said before she'd even taken her shoes off. One Sunday, Elena caught me sitting on the back porch alone, the narrow one behind the building that most tenants had forgotten even existed under all that ivy, and she sat down next to me without asking if she could, just settled in like the space had always been half hers. She told me about the divorce, how Grant had worn her down over 3 long years until she started apologizing for things that weren't remotely her fault, small surrenders that added up to losing herself entirely. She said the strangest part of getting free of him wasn't the loneliness. It was realizing she didn't know who she was anymore without somebody around to manage and appease. I told her about Carol, about the guilt of still being here when my wife wasn't, about how fixing things for other people had quietly become the only way I knew how to prove I still had a purpose worth showing up for. Neither of us cried, but it was close, and neither of us made a single move to leave that bench. The porch became our place after that. Most evenings, when her shift ended early enough and my rounds were finished for the night, I'd bring 2 mugs, chipped ones because that's all I owned, and she'd bring whatever leftovers she'd made too much of that week, and we'd sit under that one flickering porch light I kept meaning to replace and somehow never did, because it felt like it belonged to us, exactly as broken as it was. Ruthie started calling it our office hours, teasing that the two of us did more talking out there than either of us managed anywhere else in our actual lives, and she wasn't wrong about that one bit. Some nights we didn't talk at all, just sat with the crickets and the hum of the highway a few blocks off, and even that silence felt like it belonged to us. I didn't have a good answer ready when she asked, straight-faced over cereal one morning, why I hadn't just said something to Elena already and gone ahead and asked her outright instead of just fixing showerheads that already worked fine and calling it a relationship. Grant started texting Elena again around that time, apologies dressed up as concern, then concern dressed up as quiet claims on her time and her attention. She'd go still reading them, her jaw tightening in a way I was starting to recognize the way you learn to read weather, and she'd set the phone face down on the porch railing like it had physically done something to her. I never asked what he wrote in those messages. I figured if she wanted me to know, she'd tell me in her own time, and pushing felt like something Grant would do, not something I wanted to become in her eyes or my own. But I noticed she started sitting a little closer to me on that porch bench every single time his name came up in conversation, like proximity to something steady was its own quiet kind of answer she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. I never asked for that closeness, but I stopped pretending I didn't notice it, or that it didn't mean something was shifting between us, whether we named it or not. By the time the leaves had mostly dropped off the big oak behind the parking lot, Ruthie asked me flat out over dinner one night if I was ever going to tell Elena how I felt, or if I planned on being the world's oldest coward about the entire thing. I didn't have a joke ready for that one, and she knew it the second the words landed. I looked at my daughter, 16 years old, and somehow wiser about people than I'd managed to become at 39, and I didn't know what scared me more, the idea of saying it out loud and having it change everything between us, or the fact that some other man with more confidence and considerably less character might say it first and mean none of it at all. I went to bed that night wondering exactly what Elena and I were building out there on that porch, and whether either of us had the nerve to give it a real name before somebody else decided to take it away from us first, because I had a feeling, even then, that Grant wasn't the kind of man who let go of something quietly just because he'd been the one to drop it. Winter came on fast that year, the kind that turns the porch cold enough to need blankets, and somehow that only made Elena and I sit out there longer instead of driving us inside. She started bringing an old quilt from her bedroom, and we'd share it across our laps, her feet tucked up under her, my arm along the back of the bench, close enough that neither of us could pretend it was an accident anymore. She told me one night, half joking, that she'd stopped checking her phone for messages the second she got home, because whatever was waiting for her on that porch mattered more than whatever Grant had to say. I didn't ask her to say things like that. She just started saying them, like the truth had gotten tired of waiting behind her teeth. I'd sit there some nights with my coffee going cold in my hands, not because I forgot to drink it, but because I didn't want to break whatever quiet thing was happening between two people who talked more with silence than most couples manage with words. Ruthie had taken to calling Elena by her first name without the miss in front of it, which for a 16-year-old is basically an engraved invitation. She started showing Elena her sketchbook, the drawings she never let me see, and Elena would sit with her for an hour some evenings, going through pages, while I pretended to fix something in the next room, just to listen. It struck me one night, watching them laugh over a drawing of our building shaped like a grumpy old man, that Elena had slid into a space in our lives I didn't even know was empty until she filled it. I hadn't seen Ruthie laugh like that, easy and unguarded, since before Carol got sick, and some nights I had to step out onto the porch myself just to keep from letting my daughter see how much that sound wrecked me in the best possible way. It felt like watching a light come back on in a room I'd stopped bothering to check on, and I wasn't ready to admit out loud how much I needed that light to keep burning. Elena mentioned Grant's job almost by accident one evening, the way people mention things they don't think matter until later. She said he handled the leasing paperwork for his father's company, Ashworth Properties, which happened to own 3 buildings on our side of the city, including, as it turned out, Magnolia Court itself. She said it lightly, an old fact about an old relationship, not realizing what it meant for me sitting there with my maintenance keys still clipped to my belt. I felt something go cold in my stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air. But I didn't say anything that night. I told myself it was a coincidence too small to matter, the kind of thing that happens in a city this size. And I almost believed it, right up until the moment, weeks later, when it stopped being possible to believe anything that convenient about a man like Grant Ashworth, a man who I would come to learn didn't do coincidence, only leverage dressed up as circumstance. Grant showed up outside the building 2 weeks later, uninvited, holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers like they meant something. Elena told me about it afterward on the porch, her voice flat in a way that told me she was angrier than she wanted to admit. He'd apologized for standing her up, blamed a work emergency that conveniently had no proof attached to it, and asked if they could try again, like the month since then hadn't happened at all. She'd told him no, politely at first, and then less politely when he pushed, and he'd left with that particular smile men wear when they've decided a no isn't really a no yet, just a delay they intend to outlast until the other person gets tired of saying it. She threw the flowers in the dumpster behind the building herself, still wrapped in their plastic, and told me she felt lighter walking back inside than she had in months, though she also admitted, quieter, that she doubted a man like Grant would take a closed door as a final answer. He came back a second time not long after, this time catching me in the hallway instead of her, and introduced himself with a handshake that felt more like a measurement than a greeting. He asked about my job, my hours, how long I'd worked at Magnolia Court, questions dressed up as small talk that weren't small talk at all. When I mentioned, without thinking much of it, that Elena and I had gotten to be friends, something behind his eyes went sharp and still, like a man recalculating a number he thought was already settled. He smiled anyway, told me it was nice that the tenants had someone so attentive looking after them, and walked off toward the parking lot in a coat that cost more than my truck, leaving me standing there with a feeling in my gut I couldn't quite name yet, something between a warning and a door quietly closing somewhere I couldn't see. I told myself men like that shook hands like that with everybody, but some quiet part of me didn't believe it, not for a second. A week later, an envelope showed up in my mailbox that didn't feel like the usual building correspondence. It was a formal notice about my maintenance contract renewal, full of clauses about tenant conduct and professional boundaries that had never once appeared in 6 years of the exact same paperwork before. It was signed by Grant Ashworth, property manager, a title I hadn't even known he officially held until that signature stared back at me from the bottom of the page. I read it twice at my kitchen table, Ruthie watching my face from across the room without saying a word, because she'd learned to read my silences the way I'd learned to read Elena's jaw tightening on the porch. I folded the letter into a drawer that night and told myself I'd deal with it in the morning, though morning came and I still hadn't found a single word that made the situation feel smaller than it was. Ruthie finally asked, gently, if it was about Elena's ex, and when I nodded, she just said good, because somebody finally needed to stand up to that guy. I didn't tell Elena at first, some stubborn instinct telling me I could handle it quietly the way I handled every other problem in that building, with a wrench and a little patience. But she noticed anyway, the way she noticed everything, and asked me straight out on the porch one night why I'd gone so quiet the past few days. I told her about the letter, watching her face shift from confusion to something harder as she put together exactly what her ex-husband's family owned and exactly what that meant for the one steady thing in her life since the divorce. She apologized like it was somehow her fault, and I told her it wasn't. But neither of us fully believed the danger had passed just because I'd said the words out loud. She reached over and took my hand right there on the porch railing, the first time she'd ever done that without a joke or an excuse attached to it, and neither of us let go for a long time. By the time the first real snow hit Dayton that December, I understood something I hadn't let myself admit before, that the man who'd left Elena standing in a doorway, in a dress meant for somebody who never came, now held my job, my apartment, and possibly my future in the same soft, manicured hands. I thought about walking away from it all quietly, letting Elena go before things got worse, protecting Ruthie from any fallout that might land on us. But then, I thought about that porch, that ratty quilt, the sound of my daughter laughing at a drawing of a grumpy building, and I knew walking away wasn't protection, it was surrender, and I had spent enough of my life surrendering to things that scared me. I didn't know yet how far Grant would go to make sure he won, but lying awake that night, I understood clearly that whatever came next, I wasn't going to face it by backing quietly out of the one life that had finally started to feel like mine again. Grant called a mandatory tenant meeting for the second Saturday of January, held right there in the lobby of Magnolia Court under those buzzing fluorescent tubes I'd been meaning to replace for years. He framed it as a chance to discuss maintenance concerns and upcoming lease renewals, and nearly every tenant in the building showed up, folding chairs dragged in from the laundry room, coffee in paper cups from the machine by the mailboxes. Elena sat near the back with Ruthie beside her, and I stood near the radiator I'd fixed the week before, arms crossed, feeling every eye in that room in a way I hadn't felt since the day the plant announced its closing over the intercom. I didn't know yet that Grant had built the whole meeting around a single purpose, and that purpose was me, standing right there in my work boots with no idea what was coming. Ruthie had begged to skip school that Saturday to be there, some instinct in her telling her this mattered, and looking back, I wish I'd listened to whatever told her that instead of insisting she stay home with her homework. He started reasonably enough, talking about a pipe issue on the third floor and a parking dispute nobody in that room actually cared about, and then, smooth as anything, he pivoted straight to what he called concerns about professionalism among building staff. He didn't say my name at first. He didn't need to. Every head in that lobby turned toward me anyway, because everybody in that building had eyes, and everybody had noticed the maintenance man spending his evenings on the back porch with the pretty nurse from 2C. Elena stiffened in her chair beside Ruthie. I felt my jaw lock the way it used to before a fight I already knew. Deep down, I couldn't win on muscle alone, because Grant wasn't swinging fists, he was swinging paperwork, and paperwork doesn't bruise the way people expect it to. It just quietly takes everything you have while you're still trying to figure out where the hit landed. Grant looked straight at me and asked, in front of 40 of my neighbors, whether it was appropriate for staff to develop personal relationships with residents while representing ownership on official duties. Somebody murmured near the mailboxes. An old man in a cardigan shifted in his folding chair, and a young couple by the window exchanged a look that said they already knew where this was headed. Elena rose halfway up before catching herself, her hand gripping the back of the chair in front of her. I said his name was Grant, and by the way every head turned, the whole room already knew exactly who he was, to her and to me. Nobody needed a family tree explained. The math did itself in real time, right there on 40 faces at once, and I watched understanding ripple back through those folding chairs like a stone dropped in still water, row by row, until it reached the back where Elena sat frozen. Elena stood the rest of the way up and told that room, voice cracking but steady, that Wyatt Doyle had done more for that building in one winter than any Ashworth had done in years, fixing what they neglected and showing up when they didn't. She said the only thing inappropriate happening in that lobby was a man using his father's company to punish a stranger for a date he himself had walked away from, standing her up in a dress she'd bought special for him. Grant's smile thinned to something colder. He reminded her, loud enough for every neighbor to hear, that her lease was also up that spring, and that Ashworth Properties made those decisions too, a threat wearing the thin, polite disguise of a simple fact, delivered with a smile calm enough to make it worse, because everyone in that lobby understood exactly what he meant, even though he never once raised his voice to say it plainly, and that quiet cruelty was somehow more chilling than if he'd shouted it across the room. The room went dead silent, except for one chair creaking somewhere in the back, and I felt every second of that silence pressing down on my chest like a hand. Elena didn't sit back down. She just stood there, facing him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her shrink. Her chin lifted the exact same way it had been the night she opened her door to me in that dress, wounded, but never once broken. So I talked. 6 years of broken locks, burst pipes, and Christmas mornings spent shoveling their sidewalks before anyone woke up, never once asking for overtime, laid out plain and unhurried in front of the whole building, my voice steadier than I expected it to be given how hard my hands were shaking at my sides, and I made sure to look Grant dead in the eye for every single word of it, because a man like that needed to see who exactly he was trying to erase. Grant's face went red under those fluorescent lights, and he said if I had a problem with how the building was run, my contract could be terminated for cause before the month was out. No notice required, effective that same night, and everyone standing in that lobby could watch it happen right then and there if that's what settling the matter finally took. The lobby froze around us. Elena grabbed my arm without a word, her grip tight enough to hurt, and I stood under those buzzing lights staring at the man who'd left her waiting in a doorway once already, now trying to throw me out of my own life in front of every single person I'd spent 6 quiet years taking care of. Ruthie's face had gone white in the back row, and somewhere behind Grant's shoulder, I caught sight of an older woman from the 3rd floor, Marta Reyes, watching the whole thing with an expression I couldn't quite read yet, one that would matter a great deal sooner than I realized. Before Grant could finish that sentence, a voice cut through the lobby that none of us expected. It was Ruthie, standing on her folding chair so the whole room could see her, holding up her phone. She said she'd been recording since the meeting started, every word Grant had said about firing me on the spot, and that she also had something else. Screenshots Elena hadn't even known her daughter had seen, old messages from Grant threatening Elena weeks before that missed date, messages that made it clear he'd never planned on showing up that night at all, that the whole thing had been designed to make her feel small enough to come crawling back to him. Ruthie's hands were shaking, holding that phone up over her head, but her voice never wavered once, and I realized in that moment my daughter had inherited something from her mother. I hadn't seen surface quite like that before, a refusal to stay quiet when quiet meant letting somebody get away with something cruel. The room turned as one body toward Grant, and for the first time all evening he had nothing smooth to say. Marta Reyes, who'd lived on the 3rd floor since before I started working there, stood up next, her voice shaking with age but not with doubt, and told the room she'd watched me carry her groceries up 3 flights every single week for 6 years without ever once being asked, and that she'd sooner believe the sky was falling than believe a word Grant Ashworth said about anybody's character. 2 more tenants stood after her, one after another, an elderly veteran from the 1st floor, and a young mother I'd helped move a crib up 3 flights of stairs in a snowstorm, each adding their own small proof to the pile Grant clearly hadn't expected to face. Then the lobby door opened, and a man I didn't recognize walked in, older, silver-haired, wearing a coat that made Grant's look cheap by comparison. It was Walter Ashworth, Grant's father, the actual owner of Ashworth Properties, who lived across town and rarely visited his buildings in person. Someone, it turned out later, a tenant with a nephew who worked in the family office, had called him the moment the meeting started sounding like a public firing. He'd come to see for himself, still in the same suit he must have worn to a Saturday morning meeting somewhere across town, and the sight of him alone was enough to make Grant's shoulders drop half an inch, the first crack I'd seen in that man's composure all night. Walter listened to the recording in silence, his jaw tightening with every second, and then he asked to see the maintenance contract Grant had altered outside of any legal renewal window, the one sitting folded in my kitchen drawer at home. When I handed it to him with shaking hands, he read it twice, then looked at his son with an expression I recognized, the specific disappointment of a father who has just understood exactly what his child has become. He asked Grant one question, quiet enough that only the front rows heard it, whether he'd truly altered a working man's contract out of spite over a woman who'd simply chosen someone kinder. And Grant had no answer that didn't sound exactly as small as the question made it look. Walter didn't raise his voice either. He simply told Grant, in front of the entire lobby, that he was removed from any authority over tenant contracts, effective immediately, and that my position and Elena's lease would both be honored under their original terms, permanently, with a personal apology attached from the family. Grant left that lobby alone, and nobody in that building watched him go with anything close to sympathy. Elena found my hand in the crowd of neighbors congratulating me, and pulled me quietly out onto the back porch, away from the noise, the quilt still folded on the bench from our last night there. She said it was finally time to choose, out loud, with nobody listening, and asked plainly whether I wanted this, wanted her, without a landlord or a threat between us anymore. I didn't answer with words. I just reached over, the way she had for me weeks before, and didn't let go. I had no idea, sitting there under that busted porch light, just how much that quiet answer would end up changing for both of us within the year. A year passed faster than I expected it to. Elena moved down into 2C's old apartment for exactly 1 month before we both admitted the separate leases were a formality neither of us needed anymore, and now we share the corner unit on the 2nd floor with the good afternoon light, the one she used to get dressed in for a man who never once deserved the effort. That navy blue dress hangs in our closet these days, not hidden in the back anymore, not a wound, just a dress, a reminder of the worst night that somehow led us to the best years either of us had known in a long time. Ruthie kept her promise to call Elena by her first name, though lately it started slipping into something warmer when she thinks nobody's listening closely enough to notice. A small word she still hasn't said out loud on purpose, and one neither of us has pushed her to rush. Walter Ashworth kept his word too. He promoted me to building manager for all 3 of his properties that spring, a title with an office and a salary I never once expected to see attached to my name, and he told me straight out that watching his own son fold under a room full of ordinary people had taught him more about character than 30 years running that company ever had. Grant moved out of state, last I heard, working some job far away from anything with his family's name attached to it. Marta Reyes still takes her coffee on our back porch most Sunday mornings, quilt over her knees, telling anyone who'll listen that she saw the whole thing coming from the very first week Elena moved in, long before either of us had the sense to see it ourselves. I gave her a spare key to our unit last Christmas, mostly so she'd stop pretending she needed an excuse to come check on us. The porch light finally got fixed, not by me this time, but by Ruthie, who insisted on doing it herself as a surprise, standing on a stepladder in the cold, declaring that some things in this family had gone unfinished long enough. It flickers on steady now every evening, no more struggling to catch, and some nights I sit out there alone for a minute before Elena joins me, just to remember exactly how broken that light used to be, and how little it mattered in the end, because the people sitting under it were never broken. The way the world had spent so long trying to convince them they were just waiting for somebody to notice the silence in the right place at the right time. Some nights I still catch myself surprised that this is my life now, this porch, this woman, this daughter turning into a young woman right in front of me, and I don't think that surprise will ever fully wear off, and honestly, I hope it never does. If there's one thing I'd ask you to carry with you after hearing this, it's to think about the last time somebody showed up for you without being asked, without a reason, without anything in it for them, and whether you ever told them what that meant. Tell me in the comments about a moment somebody knocked on your door, literally or otherwise, at exactly the right time, and whether you ever got around to thanking them properly for it, because I almost didn't, and I think about that more than I let on. Because the truest love I've ever known didn't arrive dressed up and on schedule. It arrived by accident, in work boots, at the worst possible hour, and it stayed anyway. And that, more than anything else I've learned in this life, is what real love actually looks like when nobody's performing for an audience.